I will share some slides with you, and you will also have a chance to look at the slides separately if you want. So let me just share the screen with you with my slides here, and then we'll get going. So here we are. Here we go, like that. I hope you can see this. So then we have the title, Clusters and Disruption. I would start to talk about disruption as a concept, and then I will move on to the issue of clusters a little bit later. I will also present to you a little matrix that I use to understand disruption, that there are different types of disruptions. But let's go right into the presentation. So first, what is disrupted? Of course, we can think of firms being disrupted. We often talk about, companies like Kodak or Polaroid, or America Online, or Motorola, or Toys R Us, etc., or Nokia. I know a lot of you teach the Nokia case, which was disrupted in the handset business. So of course, firms are disrupted by various competitive forces. Sometimes whole industries are also disrupted. And as we will talk about today a bit, sometimes whole clusters are disrupted. So the old sort of strongholds, for example, of automotives in Detroit was disrupted, and there are many of these old clusters that have disappeared. And if you remember from my red book, I refer to these as the museums. We'll come back to that. We talked about that a lot. First, I will introduce a little bit, and probably you are all familiar with Joseph Schumpeter's work about 100 years ago, talking about the entrepreneur and the innovator, the person or the company that brings new ideas, new technology, new products, etc., to markets, which is, I think, key to understand disruption. I mean, we know that over the long haul, most firms, most industries, and all clusters will be disrupted. But we will take a look today and try to understand why are some firms, industries, or some clusters more resistant to these disruptive forces? What drives disruption actually to happen, and when does it not happen, so to say? I will use the donkey as the disruptor, the company or entrepreneur that brings a new idea to a market. And I will also refer to Schumpeter's work here today as Schumpeter's 5, because he sort of introduced 5 different dimensions of entrepreneurship or innovation. So I will come back to that and talk about all those 5, because the more of these Schumpeterian 5, the bigger the chance that actually a firm, industry, or cluster will be disrupted. So that is sort of the origins, what I call origins 1. Think of this as the endogenous story, where someone sort of inside or outside a field comes into this. I'll come back to another set of disruptive forces that I call the exogenous origin. I'll come back to that later. For you as business school teachers and researchers, I think we should bring what I call a more strategic understanding to disruption. So it's not just technology or, the fact that a certain industry or cluster is disrupted. It's about companies and entrepreneurs that do things, that are actors, that are agents. And to the left, you see I have the donkeys, i.e. the ones that are the disruptors. But on the other hand, we of course always have, and if you remember Schumpeter, he often talked about creative destruction. We have the other side of the coin, where the traditional incumbents are whatever they offer in terms of products and services is destroyed. So we have to also to look at the actions and reactions by the elephants. So what do the entrants meet? And if you remember my old radio model, based on the 4 letters W, B, M, H, we can use all of those, but today I will just use 2 of the letters, which is the B. So what do the entrants bring? And also then look at from the other side of the coin, what do the entrants meet? So the bring and the meet are going to be crucial. I will come back to that as well and give you more details on this. But let's go into this matrix as I talked about initially. There are many types of disruption, and today most of what you read and cases in business schools, etc., it's about digital disruption. Often it's about apps, on your smartphone that comes in and disrupts. But there are other types of digitally based, you could say, disruptions, so platform-based disruptions. So we have all these, famous cases of Netflix, Airbnb, Uber, Amazon, etc. And often there is a very strong digital component to the disruption here. And they disrupt then traditional industries like taxis or the bookstore or the small family hotel or traditional TV stations and so forth. But there are other parts of disruption. And first, you can think of digital, which is more traditional industries, manufacturing industries and service industries that are also disrupted. And it's not always a digital component in this, even if often actually there is some digital component to this. But there is traditional disruption. And some of my cases that I've used in MOC many years, in trucks, and so forth, telecommunications, etc. It's a lot of these traditional industries that are also disrupted here. On the other hand, also, you can think of the disruptor, the donkeys, and there are 2 main types, very, very different stories as to how this plays out. The startup, of course, is again the case we often think about. A new company comes in and is the disruptor, and they disrupt the old traditional companies in a particular industry. But there's also what I call the invader disruption, which is actually established firms that come into a new field and disrupt. And one of the famous examples of this, namely the iPhone. So Apple, if you think of my tracks that I have in the railway model, they were in a set of tracks totally different from the set of tracks that Nokia was on. That's called the Nokia tracks for the radio, telecommunications track, and the Apple was the consumer electronics and of course small computers, etc. track. And if you think of these and you listen to executives, etc., they would say for a long time, of course, that we are not competitors. So if someone asked about Nokia to the Apple leadership, they would say, Nokia is not a competitor to us. So up until 2007, when the iPhone 1 came to the market, these companies are not competitors. But then Apple is switching track, and through what I call the iPod track, which is music, they switched, and suddenly there was a head-on competition between Apple and Nokia. So that's a totally different story than going back about 30 years to the 1980s when these firms really started. Then, of course, Nokia continued on their track, which is the infrastructure, and they are one of the leaders in 5G. And Apple has continued with a number of their tracks with tablets and computers and smartphones. So that's one of the examples from one of the boxes in the top left corner there. So invader disruption is quite different from de novo disruption. And I would say often when we see disruption actually taking place, there is an invader involved. Then let's have a quick look at what I call Origins II, and we are now living in very odd times with the pandemic of the corona. And there are often a story of some major shift, which is totally outside of of telephones or hotels or whatever. And it can be a war, it can be a pandemic, it can be a natural disaster, major policy shifts, big economic crisis, like financial crisis, and some major technological breakthroughs. And these exogenous drivers, so it's not just the Schumpeterian entrepreneur that comes in with a new technology, a new product idea, or value chain or business model. These exogenous forces suddenly create totally new windows of opportunity, and there are winners and losers, and the game plays out in a quite different way. And I think we can expect in the coming years that from the pandemic we have right now, there will be winners and losers, obviously. And when you analyze that, and when you look at those things, when you work in your home countries around Asia, please make use of some of these models that I present today. It can maybe help you to look at the processes of disruption from both the disruptor point of view and from the incumbent point of view here. So here's an example I just picked up. If you go back, if you remember, back in the 1980s, when President Reagan was president, he opened up actually the military system of GPS. Today, every citizen around the world uses GPS all the time, and they think of this as a natural service that is available to everyone. This was military technology, and we had a big disaster. If you remember the South Korean disaster of the airplane that was shot down, and President Reagan said that we can't have this. With more open access to this technology, we won't have these kind of accidents. And then later on, President Clinton made sure that these scrambled signals that was offered in the 1980s and 90s changed, so we had perfect GPS signals, which created opportunity for new companies. And you can see them to the right: TomTom, Magellan, Garmin, etc. around the world, lots of these. So they pretty much disrupted a lot of these traditional industries around maps and map technologies and so forth, and using compasses, etc. So with the exogenous shock, we could see new companies come in and new business models coming in, new technologies coming in, driven from the shock. But then, of course, these companies, as often is the case, they were also disrupted. So what happened later? We had a new shock. The smartphone came in. And the smartphone could connect also to the GPS system. And suddenly you didn't have to buy separate technologies and small monitors, etc. This is one you put in the car, etc. Because you had it in your iPhone, your smartphone. So TomTom and Magellan and many of these companies, they were disrupted. Whole industry was disrupted, and the smartphone took over with new apps, with Google Maps and Waze, and there are lots of these services through smartphones that offer services to help you to navigate and in cities and take you from point A to point B, etc. So these shocks of technology and political shocks or pandemics, etc., can have a fundamental impact on the story that we're going to tell when we understand disruption. So let's move over to clusters. And in your conference today and tomorrow, you're going to talk a lot about clusters. So how does disruption connect to whole clusters, not just one firm or one industry, but actually a whole group of connected industries? And if you remember from the cookbook, and also Michael Porter, of course, has written about the life cycle. I showed sort of two scenarios, one that I call Renaissance, where traditional actors or incumbents in a particular cluster manages to get into a new era of technology and business models, etc., through a Renaissance process. Or the other one, which is going down, which is then what I call the museum, moving towards the museum state, because often the clusters that have been around and were once very competitive in world markets, they often what is left is only a museum. If you want to read more about it, you can also look back to the Red Book from 2009. So if you look at, for example, Hollywood, I call that the scenario A. That's a renaissance. The cluster survives. And there are lots of writings about Hollywood and how they managed to overcome big changes in technology and business models over several decades, you know, when they started to shoot films indoor and when the TV came, etc. So they managed to sort of to get into the Renaissance with time. And we'll try to understand today what drives whether we go to the museum stage or the Renaissance stage. The big case then is the disrupted case. That's when we see ex post, there was a disruption, the companies went out of business, they were acquired, and even clusters, the remnant that is left is just a museum there. Hollywood, as I mentioned, is typically a scenario A that has reinvented itself. We won't talk so much about that today. We're going to go into the disruption case B. Photography is a good case I have in mind. You know, in the United States, back into the 19th century, New York was the cluster, par preference with the major companies. They went bust pretty much, and Rochester and Kodak as the dominant firm took over. And Kodak went bust, and there are companies in the Tokyo area, around Frankfurt, etc., that are the leading firms, leading industries, leading clusters today. Here is another case of disruption. The rubber capital of the world, Akron, often used by Paul Krugman, Novo Nordisk, as a case with all the leading companies in one place, and today there is just the museum left. So let's try to understand a little bit, why do we get into scenario A versus getting into scenario B? So what would drive actually disruption to happen? And now I will use the radio model, that you can use both the bring side of the model, and again in the cookbook you can read more about this, and you use the meet side. And the more bring we're going to see, the more likelihood that the cluster will be disrupted, i.e. scenario B, and the more relaxed meet, i.e. the incumbents don't care about the new companies coming in, de novo entrants or invaders. So that will be also lead to scenario B here. So let's use, get some help from Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter's 5. So he had 5 dimensions to entrepreneurship and the novelty that comes into markets. The first one is about new products and services and new qualities and so forth. So you can analyze, you know, what is brought here to the market. Is it new features, new production methods, what's the cost structure of that, etc., new technology. Second is more around the process and new methods of production and transportation. Or the disruptor using new processes and new input technologies. So instead of using diesel cars, you go to battery cars. Instead of using large technology breweries, you develop microbrewery processes from retail stores to online and so forth. Now there's a big issue in Sweden of totally scrapping coal-based metallurgy and to go totally to electric furnaces, not using any coal at all to avoid carbon dioxide and environmental impact. The third one is about customer groups, new markets. Are the new niches created? Is there a new demand? And we can look at, you know, large number of dimensions: size, delivery time, convenience, capacity, speed, CSR components, etc., power consumption, and so forth. So the iPhone offers a number of other things than what the Nokia iPhone, the Nokia smartphone offered, which is part of the bring, it's part of what one of Schumpeter's 5, where Silicon Valley brought something really, really different to the market. Airbnb reached new customer groups and so forth. The fourth dimension is input materials in new ways. I took one example from Sweden here that I like, because we are using less concrete and steel now, and even large residential houses are built fully with wood beams. So they make high-tech wood beams. So in the old days, we had wood beams, you know, for many hundred years. Then we came into steel and concrete technologies, but now we are back to wood in many cases. So we build a lot of new residential houses totally with wood in Sweden, which is done with new technology, new companies, and then new clusters emerging in Sweden. The fifth is what Joseph Schumpeter called reorganizing industries, and he had a couple of things in mind. I don't think he would think exactly in these terms, but I've been trying to be kind in my interpretation here. So I put in new value chains and new business models into this dimension. So how is production function of the entrant organized? How does the entrant connect to end users? For example, if you remember again, the Nokia case, Apple actually changed the whole value chain. So they connect, when they have sold the phone, they still connect with the customer. In the Nokia case, they sold the phone and they had no idea of the user. There was a retail distribution step in between, and then there was phone used out here. No connection between Nokia as a company and users. Whole new value chain. Business model and revenue models is also something which is important in the bring. Do companies come with, do they sell the product? Do you subscribe to the product? Do you give away the product, what they call bait and hook? As long as you get the services, you can get the product for free. So you you give a bait and then you hook with a subscription later on. Freemium models in smartphones and so forth with apps. So high price record stores and special stores to low price streaming subscriptions with Spotify I use here as an example of totally reorganizing the record business here. So you have 5 dimensions from Joseph Schumpeter that you can use to analyze bring and get a view of what the entrants bring to the market. And again, entrants can be de novo, startups, or it can be invader like Apple moved into smartphones and telecommunications. Meat. We also have to look at this story from the other side, and you can use 5 forces model. I would recommend also the railway model from my cookbook there to look at the reactions by the incumbents. So what resources, capabilities do they possess, and how do they react to this? And how they react and how this plays out will have a big impact on whether disruption will happen or not. And the basic answer to the meat and to whether reaction will be swift or lax is about how well the incumbents are doing. If they are really fat and happy and make large profits, they're going to be difficult for them to react to the new technology, the new disruptive forces. So you have to look at both internal and external tracks here, and so forth. What incumbents can do, of course, they can do a lot of things. They can try to resist and fight back with their technology. They can try to adapt and bring the technology and make hybrids, or they can just go fully in and just shift to a new technology or to a new business model. So you can add a track. I put here like big pharma added generic drugs to their lines of businesses in order to be in both tracks, so to say. You can launch VC divisions, you can scout, etc. for disruptors. So you have part of the firm that is separate from the main firm to be able to meet the disruptive forces there. 5 force again. If you think of Uber, the better the 5 force, the more profitable companies are, the more more likely the chance that the disruptor will succeed. high profitable incumbents in a consolidated industry with high bargaining power vis-a-vis buyers and suppliers. That is really a recipe for sleepy reaction to disruptors, sloppy service, etc. So you can think of that as, 5 forces is a good way of understanding profitability, but you can also help you to understand why incumbents do not react to disruptive forces, which in the end will help disruption. So in summary, why do we go towards the museum stage? Yeah, of course, the more bring, if you think of Schumpeter's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if they bring novelty in all those 5, that's going to go more likely to scenario B, disruption. And in addition, if incumbents react in a weak way, a more relaxed way, that's also going to be what drives really the cluster towards the museum stage. So the more bring and the less meat, so to say, the stronger, the higher the chances that disruption will take place. Take our case again, Silicon Valley versus Helsinki. Silicon Valley brought a lot. If you analyze the case and look at this and use Schumpeter's 5 and go through those, you see that they pretty much changed all of those. There are a couple of things that are not changed, that are where they sort of still stuck with the old technology of doing phones. But also the Helsinki reaction was quite slow. They were on the tracks, so that led to clearly disruption in this handset business there. So with this, I would like to thank you. I hope this gave you some food for thought around disruption, processes in general, but also to connect disruption to clusters. And for you, if you want to learn more about this or use these materials in class, I sort of developed a series with lectures that I call On Strategy and Disruption, and you can have it from me. You can just email me, and I will be happy to send that over to you so you can use that in your classes. So I will just go back here and see if I can take away this. I'll stop sharing there, right? Okay, so here I'm back with you again. So I wish you all the luck with your conference, and hopefully this lecture gave you some ideas around disruption. Still, there's a lot of stuff that you can use on the Cluster Observatory. And again, if you want to use more of videos, etc., I'm happy to send it to you so you can use in classrooms and in your research. So thank you very much. Have a pleasant time, and hope to see you soon. Maybe next time somewhere in Asia when you do your next conference. Bye from Stockholm.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome! We're about to start our second day of the annual international forum Facing the Future, a platform where distinguished business people, experts, opinion leaders and statesmen from all over the world are discussing the most current issues of today and tomorrow. We're holding this year's event together with the European chapter of the MOC network from the Harvard's Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. Today, we will discuss how competitiveness implicates the societal fabric in the new normal.